There's something about The Hunger that feels unfinished, not incomplete in a technical sense, but emotionally as if the film itself is still mourning. Released in 1983, dressed in black leather and lace, Tony Scott's vampire thriller was everything mainstream Hollywood wasn't ready for. Erotic, experimental, and unapologetically decaying. But this wasn't just a vampire movie, it was a eulogy, a love letter to time, to beauty, to addiction. And like all eulogies, it was written with the dead in mind. From the very first frame with Bauhaus performing Bela Lugosi's Dead in a goth club soaked in blue shadows, the film plunges us into a world where nothing is stable. Not identity, not love, not even the body. The Hunger didn't just tell a story, it bled it, frame by frame, until even the characters no longer recognized who they were. David Bowie, already an alien in the cultural psyche, plays a man unraveling faster than the makeup could keep up with. Catherine Deneuve moves like a ghost sculpted from marble. Susan Sarandon smolders in her own disbelief. And the camera? It doesn't follow. It stalks. Critics didn't get it. Audiences didn't know what to do with it. And studios, well, they almost buried it. But The Hunger didn't die. It slept, and then it came back. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. The Hunger, from the club scenes that weren't choreographed, to the props that were reportedly stolen from an actual morgue, to the kiss that rewrote vampire cinema forever. You think you know what this film is about? Wait until you find out what they didn't want you to see. Fact has shown, the club scene wasn't supposed to start the film. The film opens in a haze of sweat, strobe lights, and shrieking goth rock. Bela Lugosi's Dead echoes as Miriam and John prowl through a New York nightclub. It's iconic, but that sequence? It wasn't supposed to be the beginning. Tony Scott originally intended the film to open with quiet domestic intimacy inside the Blaylocks' lavish townhouse, a slow burn before the descent, but executives found that version too elegant, not enough hook. The club sequence originally meant to appear later as a flashback was cut, rearranged, and made the opening by sheer commercial pressure. To complicate things further, Scott refused to use traditional choreography. The crowd's dancing wasn't blocked or directed. He told his team to fill the space like predators, and let the actors move through it like documentary subjects. The band, Bauhaus, wasn't even lip-syncing, they were actually performing live on set, which caused chaos with the audio team. Susan Sarandon later said, "That wasn't a nightclub, that was a vampire ritual disguised as one, and you could feel it. So the haunting opening that defined The Hunger's aesthetic, it was an accident, an afterthought, a compromise. But that's what vampires do, they rewrite the rules of entry. They don't ask to be invited in. They make you watch." Fact #2. The first kill scene was banned on television for years. When Miriam and John seduce the young couple from the club, the film slips into a ritualistic quiet. No screaming, no blood spray, just music, movement, death. What unfolds in that scene, John slicing the man's throat while Miriam cradles the woman like a lover, was so eerie in tone that several TV networks banned it during early cable broadcasts. Not because of gore, but because of how emotionally intimate the violence was. Behind the scenes, David Bowie reportedly requested that the prop blood be reduced. Not for censorship, but because he feared that too much gore would distract from the romantic despair he was trying to portray. Catherine Deneuve agreed. The scene was then restaged to emphasize breath, touch, and eye contact, something Scott called slow-motion death ballet. But it wasn't just the mood that made people uncomfortable. One of the extras playing the murdered couple later revealed they weren't told the actors would be so physical with them. "There was a moment where I thought she was actually biting me," she said. The resulting footage was so unsettling, the studio considered cutting it until Ridley Scott, Tony's brother, allegedly told him, "This is the only scene that feels real." And in a film where time collapses and lovers feed each other into oblivion, reality is the scariest thing of all. Fact #3. The cello sequence wasn't just metaphor, it was code. After the kill, we see Miriam alone, playing the cello. No words, just long, anguished notes. It's a quiet moment, but it wasn't written that way. In the original script, Miriam was supposed to be polishing ancient knives while humming, but Scott hated the cliché. He replaced the props with a cello and told Deneuve to play it like you're mourning something you can't name. Here's where it gets strange. The music she plays, a fractured version of La Signa from Carnival of the Animals, was not planned. Deneuve improvised the piece during rehearsal, and Scott kept it. But music theorists later pointed out that the way she played it seemed to mimic Morse code rhythm. No one's ever decoded what it might say, if anything. But among the gothic subculture, a rumor spread that the cello notes were a secret message to Miriam's former lovers, a kind of sonic gravestone. Even creepier, The cello used in the scene wasn't a prop. It belonged to an actual cellist who died 2 weeks before filming and whose widow insisted the instrument should keep playing, not be boxed up. So when you watch that scene, know this. You're not just hearing a character grieve. You're hearing the echoes of something or someone that refused to stay silent. Fact #4. David Bowie's makeup took longer than his screen time. John Blaylock's rapid aging is one of the most disturbing arcs in The Hunger. But what's more haunting than what we saw is what we didn't. David Bowie's transformation into a decrepit version of his character required 8–9 hours of makeup per day, overseen by a team of prosthetic artists flown in from London. According to one crew member, David was already arriving at 2 a.m. for a shoot that began at noon. But here's the twist. Despite all that effort, much of his footage was cut in post-production. Tony Scott felt that the more time the audience spent watching John deteriorate, the less impactful his disappearance would be. Bowie was reportedly upset but philosophical, telling a journalist, "It's fitting, isn't it? He vanishes just when he becomes most human." Even more strangely, the prosthetics used for Bowie's old-age makeup were stored in refrigeration units on set, and multiple pieces went missing during filming. Some say they were stolen by crew members as souvenirs. Others believe they were intentionally destroyed, after rumors spread that the latex was reacting oddly to the skin, like it didn't want to be worn. So the version of John you see on screen? It's just a fraction. Most of him was hidden under latex, behind shadows, and eventually in a coffin. Fact #5. The monkey scene was based on a real experiment that went horribly wrong. In a stark contrast to the gothic elegance of earlier scenes, the film abruptly cuts to a medical lab where monkeys turn violent. Sarah Roberts, played by Susan Sarandon, watches in shock as one chimpanzee kills its mate in a fit of inexplicable rage. It's an unsettling pivot, but what most viewers don't know is, this scene wasn't fiction. The sequence was inspired by a real experiment conducted in the early 1980 seconds, involving primates who were injected with neurohormonal compounds to study aging and aggression. One such experiment, conducted at a U.S. military-affiliated lab, reportedly ended with 2 chimps cannibalizing a third, an incident later buried under classified research files. Tony Scott got access to some of these accounts through an unnamed source in the UK scientific community. He told the production team to replicate the lab setup as close to the real one as legally possible. But even the prop animals weren't props. The monkeys in the scene were real, minimally trained, and reportedly became agitated on set, causing one handler to be bitten during filming. Susan Sarandon later remarked, "That scene wasn't about science. It was about what happens when something is forced to evolve against its nature," which, when you think about it, applies to every character in The Hunger, especially the human ones. Fact #6. The elevator scene was shot with real strangers. No one told them it was a movie. Sarah and Miriam cross paths for the first time in a tense elevator scene. One is poised, mysterious. The other flustered, caught off guard. But that moment wasn't just acted. It was engineered using real people who had no idea they were part of a film. Due to budget and time constraints, Tony Scott decided to use a real New York high-rise elevator, placing hidden cameras inside and filming Deneuve and Sarandon in character. Passersby who entered the elevator during the takes were not told they were being filmed, and their reactions were captured live. One man reportedly asked Deneuve if she was on her way to a funeral. She didn't break character. Another woman complimented Sarandon's perfume, prompting Scott to rewrite a later line in the script referencing scent. The result is a scene filled with micro-glances, hesitation, and palpable tension that feels too genuine for rehearsals. Scott would later admit he preferred ambient unease over stylized tension. "If the scene breathes too perfectly," he said, "then it's already dead." And in a film about immortality, the accidental moments may have been the only ones that truly lived. Fact #7. Bowie wasn't given a script for his breakdown scene. One of the most harrowing scenes in The Hunger shows John, now visibly withered, spiraling into despair, eyes sunken, limbs trembling, voice almost gone. He walks the streets in daylight, his beauty disintegrating as the world ignores him. David Bowie's performance here is unsettling in its rawness, but that might be because he had no script. Tony Scott reportedly told Bowie to arrive on set without lines that day. Instead, he was given only a single note: "Try to find something that proves you're still human." Bowie wandered downtown New York in full makeup as hidden cameras followed. The reactions from people on the street were real. Some turned away in disgust, others offered money, mistaking him for a dying man. When he finally collapses in a phone booth, fumbling with the dial, muttering gibberish. None of it was scripted. It was improvisation. Painfully intimate. One crew member later described watching the footage and feeling like they had invaded someone's final moment. And maybe they had, because according to urban legend, the number Bowie dials actually belonged to a real person, and they picked up only to hear static, breathing, and a whisper, "Please help me." Fact hashite. The hospital refused to let them film until they lied. Desperate, John seeks out Sarah at her clinic, begging for help. The scenes inside the hospital feel stark and institutional, a contrast to the Baroque horror elsewhere. But here's the thing, that wasn't a film set, it was a real hospital. Tony Scott's team tried to secure filming permissions from several New York medical centers, but were repeatedly denied due to the nature of the makeup and psychological content of the scene. One administrator reportedly said, "We don't want death walking our halls, even if it's fake." So the crew changed tactics. They applied under a different name, posing as a British public health documentary on accelerated aging disorders. The hospital granted them limited access with strict rules against patient interaction. David Bowie was smuggled in through the service entrance at 3 a.m., and shooting began before sunrise. Some nurses reportedly thought he was a real terminal patient. One even tried to assist him before being waved off by crew. The ruse was discovered weeks later, and the production was banned from ever returning. But by then, the footage had been captured, and the corridors where John begged for time, they've since been demolished. The building no longer exists. Fact #9. The time jump sequence was a last-minute edit, and no one agrees what it means. As John sits in the clinic waiting room, the hunger fractures. Time skips. Scenes bleed into each other. Memories interrupt the present. The editing becomes jagged, ghost-like, as if the film itself is losing coherence. This wasn't originally in the script. The narrative was supposed to be linear. But during post-production, Tony Scott had a revelation. John is dying, but more than that, his sense of time is dying. So he instructed the editors to randomly shuffle scenes, replay fragments, and overlay audio from earlier moments to simulate mental decay. What resulted was a hypnotic, confusing stretch of film that critics at the time called sloppy and incoherent. But today, many cite it as visionary, an early cinematic attempt to show neurodegeneration from the inside. There's still debate over what the final version actually depicts. Some believe John is reliving his centuries of life in reverse. Others claim the film is quietly suggesting he's becoming like Miriam, immortal, but trapped in a rotting shell. Bowie never clarified. He simply said, "Death is slow, but madness is faster." And that part of the film? It doesn't end. It fades. Fact #0. The most heartbreaking scene was rewritten the night before. John's final confrontation with Miriam is quiet. No screams, just betrayal. After centuries by her side, he realizes what all her past lovers have learned too late. Immortality was never shared, only promised. The moment where John begs Miriam not to abandon him wasn't in the original script. The original version had him turn violent, attacking her before being overpowered. But the night before shooting, David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve approached Tony Scott with a different idea. Bowie reportedly said, "It's not rage, it's grief." Deneuve added, "What's more terrifying is knowing you were never loved, only preserved." Scott agreed. The scene was rewritten just hours before filming. What resulted was a haunting reversal of vampire tropes. The predator begging not to be discarded, the immortal crying for time. Deneuve's performance, stone-faced, untouched, drew silent applause from crew. Bowie, meanwhile, insisted on doing the scene in a single take. After it ended, he didn't speak for the rest of the day. One assistant recalled, "We all felt like we'd watched a couple divorce after 300 years. And Miriam? She didn't kill him. She simply put him away, as she had so many others." Fact #9. The coffin scene was so claustrophobic, it sent one extra to the ER. John's fate is sealed in a scene few forget, locked inside a narrow sarcophagus-like box, trapped in darkness. The camera lingers on his panic, his clawing, his final gasp before silence. That box? It wasn't a prop. The production used a real 18th century French ceremonial coffin, borrowed from a private collector in Paris. It had been used during aristocratic funerals and was said to have held a real body for over 60 years. The prop department added only minimal padding. Bowie, ever the perfectionist, insisted on being locked inside for real, for authenticity. He was told there was an emergency latch. There wasn't. After filming, he was shaken but unharmed. But the extra who played a later victim, a much smaller woman, had a very different experience. She panicked during rehearsal, screamed for help, and had to be pulled out after hyperventilating. She was sent to the ER for oxygen and never returned to set. Crew began whispering that the box was cursed. One assistant refused to go near it. Another claimed it whispered when closed. The box was quietly returned to its owner and has never been used in any film again. Some things don't like to be opened twice. Fact Hasson 2. The portrait wall wasn't art direction. It was Miriam's real history. In the attic of Miriam's home sits a gallery of portraits. All of them are her past lovers, all now gone. Their faces watch in silence as the truth is revealed. Miriam doesn't love, she collects. Most viewers assume the paintings are fictional props created for set design. But here's the unsettling truth. At least 5 of the portraits were real. Tony Scott had his team source vintage oil paintings from estate sales and abandoned European villas. Some dated back to the 1600s. One in particular, a man in blue with a waxed mustache, came with a letter claiming it had been returned 3 times by families who claimed it moved. Rather than design a gallery, Scott curated it, letting the past bleed into the present. Even Deneuve was reportedly unsettled during shooting. She refused to look directly at some of the portraits between takes. In the final cut, the camera pans across the faces slowly. No jump scares, no music, just the sound of air still, dead, waiting. If you pause the frame, you'll notice one portrait has eyes that glint unnaturally. Some say it's a lighting trick, others aren't so sure. Because The Hunger was never about vampires. It was about what we leave behind when we try to live forever. Fact Hasson 3. Miriam's seduction was filmed without a single line of dialogue. The tension between Miriam and Sarah builds slowly, glances, silences, an eerie sense of inevitability. Then comes the scene that cements it. Miriam invites Sarah for a drink. But here's what's strange, there was no dialogue written for this moment. Tony Scott believed that true seduction, especially between 2 characters who don't yet understand what's pulling them together, should be visual. He gave Deneuve and Sarandon only stage directions. Offer her wine, play music, don't speak unless you have to. Most of the scene was shot with 2 cameras rolling simultaneously, with Scott moving silently around the set, whispering notes only when necessary. He later said he wanted to capture the gravity between them, not the words around it. The music playing in the background, Loch May's Flower Duet, wasn't in the script either. It was added during post-production because someone on the editing team remembered hearing it during their mother's funeral. The result is a scene that feels less like courtship and more like fate, pulling 2 people towards something they don't understand or maybe can't escape. And in that silence, something irreversible begins. Fact Hasson 4. The kiss wasn't planned and it changed film history. The infamous kiss between Sarah and Miriam wasn't supposed to happen. Not that way. Not then. In the original script, the scene ends with a lingering embrace and a dissolve to black. But moments before the camera rolled, Tony Scott whispered something to Deneuve. Then he turned to Sarandon and said, "Just respond naturally." What followed was one of the most controversial and groundbreaking kisses in horror film history. Sensual, strange, and undeniably raw. Susan Sarandon later admitted she was caught off guard, but chose to stay in character. "It didn't feel exploitative," she said. "It felt dangerous, like I was stepping off a cliff." Catherine Deneuve never commented in detail, but when asked if the scene had been rehearsed, she simply replied, "Real seduction doesn't rehearse." Studio executives panicked. Some wanted the scene removed entirely. Others demanded it be reshot to feel less threatening to audiences. Scott refused, and that decision rippled. The kiss would go on to inspire a wave of academic essays, underground screenings, and eventually, a redefinition of queer representation in Gothic cinema. What began as an improvisation became a revolution. Fact Hasson 5. Susan Sarandon lost a major role because of this film. The fallout from The Hunger wasn't limited to critics or box office returns. For Susan Sarandon, it came with personal cost. Just months after filming wrapped, Sarandon was considered for a leading role in a major Hollywood drama. But according to a casting insider, one executive vetoed her name, citing public discomfort with The Hunger's sexual ambiguity. Sarandon later confirmed in an interview that she had lost at least one high-profile role due to the backlash. "They thought I'd crossed some line," she said, "as if kissing a woman made me radioactive." She never named the film, but some speculate it was Terms of Endearment, whose lead role eventually went to Deborah Winger. Years later, Sarandon would reflect, "It was worth it. If a single person felt seen or less alone, then that kiss did its job." The Hunger may not have been a commercial success, but for many, it was the first time queerness wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was centered, bathed in candlelight, and unafraid. Fact Hasson X. The blood-drinking scene was almost cut for being too quiet. After their night together, Sarah wakes up disoriented, her memory fragmented, her body changed. Then comes the moment of truth. Miriam offers her blood. But unlike most vampire films, there's no dramatic music, no screams, no violent lunges, just silence, trembling hands, contact. When the studio saw the rough cut, they panicked. One executive called the scene emotionally sterile and boring. He suggested adding sound effects, heartbeat, moans, anything. Tony Scott refused. What they didn't understand was that Scott had modeled the scene after footage of real predatory feeding patterns in nature documentaries. Slow, deliberate, almost sacred. To heighten the intimacy, the sound team removed nearly all ambient noise, forcing viewers to hear only breath and skin contact. The result was so visceral, early test audiences described it as uncomfortable in a way sex scenes never were. Even the lighting was designed to mimic clinical environments, sterile, cold, surgical. One film scholar later wrote, "It's the quietest moment in the film and the most violent. It's not about passion, it's about ownership. And in that silence, Sarah dies. Or something inside her does." Fact Hassan 7. The final reversal was kept secret from the cast. As the film spirals toward its climax, Miriam attempts to preserve Sarah just as she did with John. But something goes wrong. Sarah resists, fights. And in a shocking twist, Miriam begins to decay her power, turning against her. That sequence where Miriam ages, collapses, and is surrounded by the undead remnants of her former lovers was not in the original shooting script. Tony Scott wrote it after a dream he had midway through production. In the dream, the house devoured her. He filmed the new ending over 2 days, telling only the special effects team and Catherine Deneuve what would happen. Susan Sarandon arrived on set, assuming she was filming a dream sequence, only to find herself surrounded by crumbling prosthetics and fog machines. The other mummified lovers were played by real contortionists, sealed inside airtight makeup for hours. One nearly fainted from heat exhaustion. Scott believed the twist shouldn't just surprise the audience, it should destabilize the actors themselves. And it worked. Deneuve later said, "I didn't act that ending, I reacted to it." Fact Hassan 8. The ending was changed because test audiences refused to let Sarah die. In the original cut of The Hunger, Sarah dies. Full stop. Her body deteriorates. Miriam mourns. Fade to black. But when the film was shown to test audiences in London, the reaction was furious. Viewers walked out. One woman reportedly yelled, "You don't kill the only character with a soul." Faced with backlash, the studio demanded a new ending. Tony Scott pushed back until Susan Sarandon called him and said something that changed his mind. If she's dead, then Miriam wins, and nothing changes. So they rewrote it. The final scene, Sarah standing on a balcony, reborn, surrounded by lovers of her own, was filmed weeks after principal photography wrapped. But even that ending was left ambiguous. Is she alive? Is she undead? Is she free? Or has she become the very thing she feared? Tony Scott never clarified. When asked, he simply said, "Some hungers survive the cure." And in that final frame, with the wind in her hair and the past behind her, Sarah doesn't smile. She watches and waits. Fact Hashonanin. The Hunger flopped, then quietly changed Gothic culture forever. When The Hunger premiered in 1983, it was a box office disappointment. Critics called it style over substance, incomprehensible, and cold. Roger Ebert famously dismissed it as an art film with fangs. But while Hollywood ignored it, another world was watching. Within months, The Hunger became a cult obsession in underground clubs, especially among the growing goth scene in London, Berlin, and New York. The fashion in the film, Miriam's veils, John's tailored suits, Sarah's minimalist rebellion, became templates for Gothic aesthetics that still persist today. More than that, it introduced a new archetype of vampire. Not monstrous, but melancholic. Not repulsive, but tragically beautiful. Anne Rice, author of Interview with the Vampire, would later credit The Hunger as helping shift public perception of the vampire from predator to romantic anti-hero. Bands like Bauhaus, Susie and the Banshees, and even 9 Inch Nails referenced the film visually. One nightclub in Paris began hosting monthly Hunger Nights, where guests dressed as characters and reenacted scenes. So while the studios shelved it and the critics dismissed it, The Hunger found its audience elsewhere in the shadows where it had always belonged. Because sometimes, failure is just a seed waiting to bloom underground. Fact #20. Several crew members claimed the film followed them after production. After filming wrapped, a quiet unease lingered among the crew. Nothing dramatic, just strange. The assistant prop master reportedly began sleepwalking, something he had never done before. He told friends he kept dreaming of faces with no mouths. One cinematographer claimed his apartment filled with white moths for a week, despite living on the 14th floor. But the eeriest story came from a script supervisor, who said she heard violin music playing in her home weeks after production ended, specifically the same melody Deneuve played on the cello. There was no source, no neighbors playing, just sound. These stories were never officially documented. They circulated as whispers. But when The Hunger was released on VHS in the late 80s, a bonus feature included an offhand remark from Tony Scott: "Films are like spells. You cast them, and sometimes they keep echoing back." Whether you believe the film was cursed, haunted, or simply too beautiful to be forgotten, one thing is certain. The Hunger didn't end in the credits. It stayed hungry. Bonus fact: the final frame was recut without the director's permission. In the final shot of The Hunger, Sarah stands above a new city, surrounded by new lovers. Miriam is gone. Or is she? What most viewers don't know is that this last moment, the last image you see before the credits roll, wasn't directed by Tony Scott. Scott's original cut ended in silence, on the shattered remains of Miriam, her beauty decaying in the attic. It was meant to be tragic, final, but the studio balked. They feared audiences wouldn't accept a story with no survivors, no clarity, and no hope. So without Scott's approval, an alternate ending was inserted, one that had been shot as a marketing backup. It showed Sarah, alive and poised, clearly positioned as the new immortal. Scott was furious. He felt the new ending contradicted the film's themes of addiction, abandonment, and identity collapse. But by the time he saw it, the reels had already been distributed. To this day, the director's cut of The Hunger has never been officially released. It exists only in rumors, an alternate ending locked in a vault, where Sarah dies, Miriam fades, and The Hunger ends with silence, not continuation. Film historians have tried to locate it. No one has succeeded. But every so often, a bootleg frame appears online, grainy, discolored, showing a final shot no one remembers filming. Maybe it's a hoax, or maybe the real ending was too honest to survive. So was The Hunger a vampire film, a love story, or a slow-motion obituary? Tell us in the comments. Which fact rewrote the film in your mind? Was it the unplanned kiss, the buried director's cut, or the idea that the cello scene might have carried a secret message for the dead? And more importantly, do you believe Sarah won, or just became another version of Miriam? Like, subscribe, and let us know what hidden film you want us to uncover next. Because some stories don't end, they just get buried deeper.